He welcomed them as friends. He gave them land when they had nowhere to go. He defended them when his own people wanted them gone, and for his kindness they buried him alive. This is the story of Chief Waiyaki wa Hinga, the man who trusted the British and paid the ultimate price for his generosity. His name was Waiyaki wa Hinga, and in 1890 he ruled over vast lands stretching from what is now Karura to the Ngong Hills. He was a Mutamaki, a territorial leader, with more than 10 wives and countless cattle. His fortified villages dotted the frontier between Kikuyu and Maasai territory, and his word was law in all of southern Kikuyu land. But Waiyaki was not born Kikuyu. His real name was Koyaki, son of Kumale Ole Lamotaka, a Maasai refugee who had fled Laikipia during the terrible disasters of the 1880s. When drought, locusts, and disease devastated Maasai lands, Kumale's family sought shelter among the Kikuyu, where they were adopted by the Gatheka family and given new names. Kumale became known as Hinga, a name that meant double agent or hypocrite because he could speak both Kikuyu and Maasai. It was a name that carried suspicion, suggesting someone whose loyalty could never be fully trusted. But his son Waiyaki would prove his loyalty beyond any doubt, and it would cost him everything. On October the 10th, 1890, everything changed. Captain Frederick Lugard of the Imperial British East Africa Company arrived in Dagoretti with a small expedition, exhausted and in desperate need of supplies. They were on their way to Uganda, but they needed a place to rest, to resupply, and to establish a base for their operations. When Waiyaki met Lugard, near what is now Dagoretti Children's Center, he could have driven them away. His warriors outnumbered the British expedition, and many of his people whispered that these pale strangers brought nothing but trouble. But Waiyaki looked at the tired, desperate men and made a decision that would seal his fate. He welcomed them as friends. "I had no hesitation in trusting myself almost alone among them," Lugard would later write in his diary, marveling at Waiyaki's generosity. Here was an African chief who not only refused to attack them, but actively helped them. Waiyaki gave Lugard land at Kihumo and allowed him to construct a fort where Kihumo PCEA Church stands today. It was an act of unprecedented kindness. Waiyaki had taken strangers into his home, fed them, protected them, and given them a foothold in his territory. In return, Lugard signed a treaty with him, a piece of paper that Waiyaki believed meant friendship and mutual respect. But the British saw something different in that treaty. To them, it was not partnership, but possession. Within months, more Europeans arrived, claiming land and demanding labor. What Waiyaki had intended as hospitality, the British interpreted as submission. By 1891, Waiyaki's patience was wearing thin. The British were no longer grateful guests but demanding masters. They seized cattle without payment, imposed their will on his people, and showed no respect for the customs that had governed his land for generations. When his own warriors urged him to drive out the invaders, Waiyaki finally listened. He attacked Lugard's fort and burned it to the ground. It was a message that should have been clear. The time for friendship was over, but the British had no intention of leaving. Instead, they sent Major Eric Smith with a stronger force to build an even more formidable fortress, Fort Smith, just a few miles from the original site. For months, tension simmered around the new fort. Waiyaki's forces laid siege to it repeatedly, but the British held on, determined to maintain their foothold in Kikuyu territory. The man who had once welcomed them as friends was now their greatest enemy, and they would not forget his betrayal. In August 1892, the final confrontation came. A railway surveyor named Maktubu had been killed by Kikuyu from Githunguri, and the British planned a punitive expedition to exact revenge. But Waiyaki, still feeling some responsibility for the people in his territory, sent secret warnings to the villagers. When the British arrived at Githunguri, they found the village empty. The people had fled with their livestock, leaving nothing for the frustrated soldiers to confiscate. In their rage, they burned 30 villages and destroyed all the crops they could find before returning to Fort Smith empty-handed. On August 16, 1892, a furious Waiyaki went to the fort to protest this wanton destruction. He demanded to speak to the commanding officer, W.P. Purkis, but was refused entry at the gate. That refusal lit a fire in the heart of a man who had once been the fort's greatest protector. Waiyaki fought his way into the compound, his sword drawn, demanding answers for the burning of innocent villages, but Purkis was ready for him. In the scuffle that followed, Purkis disarmed Waiyaki and delivered a brutal blow to his head with the chief's own sword. Blood streaming from his wounded scalp, Waiyaki was overpowered by the fort's soldiers. The man who had once hosted British officers as honored guests was now their prisoner, chained by the neck and hands to a flagpost outside the very fort he had allowed them to build. He spent the night there, exposed to the elements, his head wound festering, while British soldiers mocked the fallen chief who had dared to challenge their authority. The next morning, they held a mockery of a trial in a makeshift courthouse and sentenced him to deportation to Mombasa. On September 6, 1892, they began the long march to the coast. Waiyaki, still chained and wounded, was forced to walk the same path that thousands of enslaved Africans had traveled before him. He was 378 kilometers from home, every step taking him further from the land his father had found refuge in, the land he had ruled with wisdom and generosity. But Waiyaki would never see Mombasa. 21 days into the march, near Kibwezi, his strength finally gave out. The head wound that Purkis had inflicted was infected and worsening. The man who had welcomed strangers into his home was dying far from everything he loved. What happened next would haunt the region for generations. Thinking that no one from the interior would ever learn the truth, Waiyaki's captors made a decision that revealed the depths of their cruelty. They shot the wounded chief and ordered a gang of local workers to dig a grave just a few meters from the railway line near Kakangani in Kibwezi. And then they buried him alive. Some accounts say he was buried upside down, adding a final insult to the horror of his death. Others say he was already dead when they threw him into the grave. But the witnesses were clear. Waiyaki wa Hinga, the chief who had trusted the British with his land and his life, died in that hole in the ground, far from home, surrounded by the very people he had tried to help. What the British didn't know was that Waiyaki's scouts, his Hingas, had followed the convoy and witnessed everything. They carried the terrible news back to Kikuyu land, where it ignited a fire of resistance that would burn for decades. The man who had been called a traitor for welcoming the British was now revealed as their victim. His death transformed him from a controversial collaborator into a martyr, and his memory became a rallying cry for all who opposed colonial rule. In a twist of cosmic justice, Purkis himself fell ill just 1 month later while traveling to Mombasa. He died at Kibwezi and was buried in the same ground as the man he had murdered, their bones mingling in the soil they had both shed blood over. For over a century, Waiyaki's exact burial site remained unknown. Children attending school near Kibwezi police station in the 1920s and 1930s were forbidden from playing in certain areas, as if the very ground was cursed by the memory of what had happened there. As the years passed and Kenya gained independence, Nairobi grew into a sprawling metropolis. One of its major thoroughfares was named Waiyaki Way, honoring the chief who had died for trusting the wrong people. Millions of Kenyans drive along that road every day, most never knowing they are traveling a path named for a man buried alive for his kindness. Today, 132 years after his death, Waiyaki's family is still fighting for justice. They want his remains found and brought home for a proper burial. They want recognition for a man who has been both celebrated as a hero and condemned as a collaborator, often by people who never knew the full story of his tragedy. Because the truth about Waiyaki wa Hinga is more complex and more heartbreaking than either version of his legend. He was not a simple hero or a mere collaborator. He was a man caught between two worlds, trying to navigate an impossible situation with wisdom and compassion. When the British came to his land hungry and desperate, he fed them. When they needed shelter, he gave them a place to stay. When his own people wanted to drive them out, he defended them. He signed their treaty believing in the possibility of peace and mutual respect. His crime was not betrayal or collaboration. His crime was trusting people who saw kindness as weakness, generosity as submission, and hospitality as an invitation to conquest. In our modern world, where cynicism often seems like wisdom and trust feels dangerous, Waiyaki's story carries a painful lesson. Sometimes the price of being good is paid by the innocent. Sometimes those who extend their hand in friendship find it bitten by those they try to help. But perhaps there is another lesson in Waiyaki's story. Perhaps the fact that we still remember him, still speak his name, still drive on roads named in his honor, means that goodness is not forgotten even when it is punished. Every time you travel Waiyaki Way, remember the man it was named for. Remember that beneath the concrete and steel of modern Nairobi lies the story of a chief who chose trust over suspicion, hospitality over hostility, hope over fear, and remember that somewhere near Kibwezi, in a grave that has never been found, lies a man who proved that the greatest tragedy is not dying for your beliefs, but dying for your kindness. His name was Waiyaki wa Hinga. He welcomed strangers as friends, and for that act of grace they buried him alive.